where we're focusing on how the housing crisis and other housing issues are relating to climate migration and managed retreat. We have four guests today with 3 overall presentations. I'll let them introduce themselves when they are presenting for their 10-minute presentations. Here is the agenda for today. We're starting with updates right now. And then Dan and Kelly will present from Climate Central, then Deborah will present, and then Jen will present. And those will be 10-minute presentations each, and then we'll have a Q&A for the rest of the time. Updates for the group. Welcome to the group. If you haven't been to a meeting before, obviously we talk about all things climate migration and managed retreat. We have 3 big goals this year: to create a curriculum format for climate migration and managed retreat as a group. So this series is on housing. We'll have another series on receiving communities, and a third one to be announced. If you have thoughts and feelings about what those should be, feel free to email the leadership team, any one of us, and we'll try to incorporate that, and we will continually ask for feedback like that at any time. The second group is the Manifesto and policy advocacy, and the third is spotlighting our members and a resource exchange. Updates on that, what I just said, and then I'll let Christian give this update, and then we'll dive into the speakers.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Colleen, everybody. Christian Kamrath, just a reminder for folks to mute themselves. Thanks. Christian Kamrath, part of the leadership team with the Climate Migration Managed Retreat team. Many of you probably have been staying tuned. One of the main outputs of this past year has been Climate Migration and Managed Retreat Manifesto. And thank you to everybody who contributed to that. It's sort of an iterative process. And thanks to Brianna and ASAP staff for getting it published on our website now. I think I'm going to plug in the link here right now for folks to check it out. It's 3 pages, describes the purpose of the manifesto, and then looks through these guiding principles that we've outlined. And really it's to help document our shared understanding, think about aspirations, and kind of put on paper some of the values that we hope to help guide our future collaborations and activities. So please take a look and share with folks. And yeah, with that, we can go to the next slide. We're happy to follow up on the manifesto, but yeah, we can start. Colleen, I'm happy to introduce our first guest, or I don't know if you want to.
I feel like they can just introduce themselves.
Okay.
Our first guest is from Climate Central.
Sounds great.
Dan, you're muted.
Try that again. Hopefully you can see my screen. My name is Dan Rizza from Climate Central. I manage the program on sea level rise. Thanks for inviting us to join this conversation today. Climate Central is a nonprofit research and communications group. We're based in Princeton, New Jersey, founded 2008, about 30 people here. We're non-advocacy, nonpartisan, and we build tools to help coastal stakeholders know when the places they care about will be at risk from rising seas and coastal flooding. We base our tools on peer-reviewed research that our scientists conduct, and today we'll be focused on presenting the results from an analysis on the risk of sea level rise and coastal flooding, the risk it poses to affordable housing in the United States. That was published in the Journal of Environmental Research letters by scientists at Climate Central, National Housing Trust, and University of California. So if you're a planner, you work on policy, you're thinking about affordable housing in the next 20, 30, 40 years, our findings can help inform your thinking on this topic. And our analysis in the tool that my colleague Kelly Van Baalen will be presenting goes down to the zip code level. So I'll just run through the findings of the first, and then we'll get to the web tool. But the large majority of the past research on flooding and sea level rise is focused on property damage and population as a whole. In this research, our scientists came up with new ways to measure risk. So we aim to quantify the current and future coastal flood risk to the nation's affordable housing inventory so that local, state, and federal stakeholders can understand the overall exposure of this already scarce resources. So we focused on the year 2050 in the paper, although our web tool lets you choose other years. But the analysis reveals that the threats that could affect residents and allows stakeholders an opportunity to plan for resiliency. The study focuses on prior methods for characterizing the impacts of coastal flooding and sea level rise in a number of ways. It advances on prior methods. So the data that we received contained latitude and longitude coordinates for each building. And so a couple of years ago, Microsoft publicly released a map of building footprints across the United States. So our scientist colleagues paired each affordable housing site from our data set with a building from the Microsoft data set and combined that with localized sea level rise projections and coastal flood risk statistics to calculate and estimate the annual probability of flood risk events at each building over the coming years. That we did this instead of choosing a small number of scenarios. So of particular concern is the exposure of housing that is considered affordable to low income households. By that, we mean housing that is federally subsidized. We received that data set from the National Housing Preservation's data set of federally subsidized buildings, or natural occurring, meaning it is unsubsidized, but rents below the local market rates, or for less than 30% of the local median household income. And we received that data set from the CoStar building rating system. So this housing is exceedingly scarce. It's nationwide, there are only an estimated 35 affordable housing rental units available for every 100 extremely low income renters. So that's a national shortfall of over 7 million units. And these homes are also particularly vulnerable to flooding as affordable housing tends to be older and rarely equipped with resilience enhanced features such as flood proofing or off-grid energy or backwater valves due to the cost of these measures. So additionally, residents in affordable housing, they often lack the financial resources to repair, rebuild, or retreat from their housing after it is damaged by floodwaters. So here are the findings. As sea levels rise, it will make it will cause coastal floods to go higher and become more frequent. So think of a location that sees a 1 foot flood every year. So as seas rise a foot, it will make that annual flood level 2 feet per year instead of 1 foot per year. So this will increase damage and will cause the flooding to occur more frequently. The research shows that the number of affordable housing rental apartments at risk from coastal flooding exacerbated by sea level rise is expected to more than triple during the next 3 decades. So by 2050, virtually every state is expected to have at least some affordable housing exposed to more than 1 coastal flood risk event per year on average. So that's up from about half of the coastal states in the year 2000, which was their baseline year. A flood risk event occurs when local coastal water levels reach higher than the building's ground elevation, and any known barriers do not provide full protection. We found that New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts have the largest share of affordable housing stock and a number of units at risk. Projections for New York City, Atlantic City, and Boston show that each city could have thousands of units exposed to chronic coastal flooding by 2050. The web tool my colleague Kelly will be showing you will cover a lot more of kind of different administrative areas and across different states. You can kind of fine tune your interest to different places in the web tool. And the combination of physical vulnerability of affordable housing, socioeconomic vulnerability, and more frequent flooding due to sea level rise presents a triple threat within the next 30 years to residents and owners of the country's already scarce affordable housing. My colleague Kelly will share a link to our report that you can check out. I'm going to share some of the charts really quickly. So here is a table showing us affordable housing units at risk now and in 2050 under high carbon emissions scenario, under kind of an unchecked pollution scenario. So you can see 2000 is the baseline of expected number of units exposed per year. That is in blue. And then you can see that by 2050, the expected number of units jumps up in orange by state. And we'll share these slides with you so you'll have the details of what I'm covering. It may be hard to see. Here's the same analysis, just in table format. Here's another chart showing the future threat to coastal flooding to the top 20 cities exposed for 2050 under the unchecked RCP 8.5 scenario. So you can see the expected number of units exposed per year in 2050 with the blue bars, and the orange line is the percentage of affordable housing in that location. Same format, you can have those as slides later. So on our website that we'll share the link to, we have a landing page with the key takeaways, the report, and links to our web tool. It's available, our materials, our report and web tool is available in English and Spanish, along with our fact sheets. We did an online workshop we encourage you to check out on our website. You can get there from the landing page of the web tool. And we brought in some folks from the affordable housing field who discussed the findings and their work and how they are tackling this challenge. There's lots of details and methodology in our tool and reports. We also have fact sheets, as I mentioned, by state, so you can download these, bring them with you to your meetings as needed. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kelly, who can walk us through the web tool that we built to accompany this.
Thanks, Dan. Just gotta share the screen. So Dan can share the link to this tool, but you can find it at coastal.climatecentral.org. But to avoid some Zoom shenanigans, I'm going to show you screenshots of the tool so it doesn't lag at all. So when you come to the tool and you go select the affordable housing map, you should see a map here with these different regions color coded, and they're color coded by the number of affordable housing units at risk. So if you click on a specific area, you can get the exact number at risk, but you can also just look at the legend in the right-hand bottom corner if you just want to get an idea comparatively. So the map defaults to showing risk by 2050, but if you use the slider on the left-hand side, you can change that from any year from 2030, 2040, all the way out to 2100, and see how that risk is going to change over time. And like Dan mentioned, this map is very customizable. So the first thing you'd probably want to do is go in and select which state you're interested in. We include every coastal state in the United States. Then you can go in and actually choose what sort of areas you want to compare. So it defaults to showing you counties, but you can compare risk by state, congressional district, city, state legislative districts, all the way down to zip codes, whatever works for you. There are also a few more technical settings that you can get to if you click this change other settings button down the left-hand corner. That'll open this menu, and you can see that you'll be able to change the housing type. So it defaults to showing you all affordable housing, but if you would only like to see subsidized affordable housing, not subsidized and naturally occurring, you can choose that. You can also change the pollution scenario or the emission scenario. It defaults to showing you unchecked pollution because unfortunately that's kind of what we're closest to at the moment. But if you want to see what might change if we were to cut our pollution moderately or deeply, you can see that as well. So, you know, this map is extremely customizable. If you're an activist in Boston who wants to, you know, talk to elected leaders about the risk here, you could choose to look at congressional districts in Massachusetts. If you're a planner in Atlantic County, New Jersey, you could go look at which zip codes within your purview are the most at risk. You know, if you're a journalist in Florida, you could look at risk by county. Whatever works for you. And then once you kind of set up what areas you are most interested in seeing the risk to, what year, pollution scenario, all that jazz, you can share the map by clicking on the little share button in the top right corner. That'll allow you to share the map by email or on Facebook or Twitter. You can also download a lot of the information from the map. And this is one of my favorite features. You can download just the map image. You can download CSV data that includes, you know, the risk for every single subregion that you're looking at. And then you can also download a fact sheet, which Dan briefly mentioned. And these fact sheets include both a map image and these like the actual numbers for the top at-risk regions in the area you're looking at. And it also includes this kind of wrapper information and makes these fact sheets very self-sufficient. So, this actually in and of itself will explain the analysis, give a lot of background, even includes some resources that might be useful. And so that's most of it. If you're interested in kind of digging in deeper, you can click the details and limitations button here. And this will pull up a huge amount of information. You can find out all about exactly how the analysis was done, what the data sources are, things like that we don't have time to go into today. And finally, all of our tools are available in Spanish. So you can just click that Espanol button down in the bottom right corner, and the whole tool will switch over to Spanish. The fact sheets and the CSV downloads, all of it is all available in Spanish. So I think we're pretty quick. So I'll show you guys a second map that we have. That's the affordable housing map is really useful in showing aggregate risk, but we find that a lot of people are interested in seeing the risk to a very specific location. And in that case, you might want to check out our year map. So you can switch maps by clicking the choose map button. That pulls up this drop-down menu, and all these maps are really interesting, and I encourage you to go play around with them. But for now, we'll look at the year map. So the year map shows areas below a flood or sea level in a given year. You can use the search bar in the top right corner of the screen to go to a specific location. And these maps are powered by Google Maps. So any place that you've been able to search and find in Google Maps, you should be able to find in ours. Pan, zoom, all that's the same as you're used to. So once you navigate to an area, you use these buttons to zoom in. You can see down to the neighborhood level, what areas are at risk from these different flood levels. You can even click this drop down in the top right and switch to a satellite view. That can be really helpful if you're trying to find a specific location and Google doesn't really know about it. And then just like the other map, you can click the change other settings, and I won't go as deep here, but basically you can make this map show you just sea level rise. You can see sea level rise plus an annual flood, a moderate flood, a major flood. You can change the pollution scenario and even get into more technical stuff like which sea level rise model you're interested in. So I think that's it. And I think we're doing questions all together at the end. So I will stop sharing for now. You can go on to the next one. Sorry,
I guess this moves on to me. Hi, I'm Deborah Morris. I'm excited to be here. I'm an urban planner and designer focused on climate adaptation risk and affordable housing. And I'm so excited that ASAP brought us all together and about this broader series on climate change and housing. And I want to thank the other co-panelists and all of you for coming here to learn and talk while I share my screen. So I plan to talk about the interrelationship between housing and climate vulnerability, and I'm going to explore some lessons learned from my time directing resiliency planning at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, as well as some specific lessons from managing the city's Sandy Recovery Acquisition and Buyout Program, since I know that managed retreat is a hot topic here in buyouts. Oops. So as local and global populations continue to grow, this means we have to learn how to do more with less by using renewable energy, finding significant efficiencies in how we feed and house ourselves. And although the changing climate is making it more difficult to predict weather and severe events, it's not unpredictable that lower income people, predominantly non-white people, locally and globally, are more significantly more likely to be affected by climate change and severe weather events. And the word resilience and resiliency are popular catchphrases to describe measures that can mitigate risk, including flood barriers, elevating housing, and physical retreat. And these measures are all important parts of any solution. However, rarely do these efforts successfully reconcile non-environmental forces such as redlining, exclusionary zoning, and fundamental threats to autonomy, which have pushed people into areas of risk. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about, oops, sorry, there's a siren. Tell you a little bit about New York City in case you haven't visited New York City recently, like many of us quarantining, or if the last time you didn't leave central Manhattan. I wanted to show you just a variety of the types of housing in New York City, particularly its waterfront communities, encompassing both public affordable housing, rent-regulated affordable housing, and naturally occurring affordable housing, both rental and ownership. So New York City is a city of renters. As of 2018, 2/3 of New York City residents rented their homes, and renters do cross the economic spectrum from very high to very low income. Yet housing in the city is extremely expensive and extraordinarily challenging. The city's vacancy rate is around 3.5%, which results in significant housing challenges in both choice, overcrowding, and poor maintenance. Also, access to housing opportunities is extraordinarily unequal. New York City is economically and racially segregated. Access to amenities and higher quality community resources. This combination of high costs and limited availability is a daily disaster. Over 60,000 people seek housing in an emergency shelter every night. Despite an aggressive affordable housing construction program, New York does not have housing sufficient for all who want to live within it. Locally and regionally, construction of housing is suppressed both through zoning and environmental regulation. In order to serve narrow interests, community members will often use environmental regulations to oppose all housing development, including affordable housing, citing issues such as stormwater management and overburdened infrastructure to prevent housing construction, or stoking fears about community change and gentrification. In a region as dense and developed as New York, this combination of restrictions and oppositions makes it virtually impossible to develop new affordable housing. New York City's building stock is extremely old and has not kept pace with population growth. As you can see, the majority of New York City's housing stock predates 1940, and most significant building codes, which were put into place in the 1960s, and implementation of the floodplain in 1983. As the population of New York City's region has grown by over 1 million residents in the last 20 years, the supply of housing to support them has stagnated. Over 1 million people live within the city's 100-year floodplain, a number that will only increase with sea level rise. So the yellow is showing the 1983 flood insurance rate maps. New York City is in the process of updating its maps with FEMA. This is the red is showing the increased area. When you take into account sea level rise, the number will only increase. Over half of the population that lives in the area, the 100-year floodplain, is considered low income by HUD. Left unabated, that number is likely to increase to 2.2 million by 2100. To help you understand what this means, I'm going to quickly tell you about a neighborhood called Edgemere, which is in the Rockaways, kind of near JFK Airport if you've flown there. The Rockaways is a barrier island off southern Queens. Communities to the west, so this way, are entirely white and middle class, while communities to the east were redlined and slums were cleared as part of urban renewal plans led by Robert Moses. The result is that housing could not be financed through traditional banks. Significant concentration of public housing and income-restricted cooperatives were located in the most flood-prone portion of the peninsula and of Queens. Housing quality is deteriorated as owners were unable to borrow and as surrounding public land remained vacant. Edgemere itself is a community that's majority minority, majority low income. Half its residents live in public housing and the other half live in 1 to 4 family homes that are predominantly owner occupied. Its residents face some of the longest commute times in the city, has very few amenities, and has had significant infrastructural challenges over the years. Like all the Rockaways, Edgemere is entirely within the floodplain. It also has a very low-lying bayfront edge, making it exceptionally vulnerable to tidal flooding. And the neighborhood experienced significant damage from Hurricane Sandy in 2012. After Hurricane Sandy, given the substantial challenges facing the people living in Edgemere, besides flood risk, the city launched a significant community planning Edgemere to understand how Edgemere residents understood flood risk and to learn what residents felt they needed in order to thrive, including significant discussions of the growing challenge of sea level rise. This 18-month effort produced the Resilient Edgemere Community Plan, which I encourage you to read. A plan is more in a document. It altered the way the city distributed disaster recovery resources, creating an enhanced buyout area to promote managed retreat, a relocation program, taking advantage of city-owned vacant land, an attached elevated home program, all of which were funded. But I will highlight that includes a framework for moving away from the shoreline, which is this area of purple, as well as short and long-term investments in flood risk management through open space expansion, some reductions in density through zoning, long-term shoreline work to enhance flood risk, as well as construction of over 200 units of new affordable housing using low-income housing tax credits, as well as city capital dollars. These 200 units have now been built. The second building opened last fall. As I mentioned, this plan changed disaster recovery program, so I wanted to explain what managed retreat means in the context of disaster-affected low-income renters. So I'm just going to quickly tell you about the experience of a low-income renter and a low-income homeowner. So on the left, this here is Desiree's storm-damaged home. Desiree's family didn't want to sell their property because the money they would receive through a buyout wouldn't purchase them as much space as they currently had within the city's borders. They also liked living in Edgemere and just wanted to be in a safer location so they wouldn't experience another Sandy. Since New York City had a significant amount of vacant land in this neighborhood, it was able to relocate Desiree's home by building a new home a little further from the waterfront and a little inland. It's still in the floodplain, but it's a new elevated home in the community they care about. So that's the new home. And that's Desiree and her family having a wedding for her daughter. This here is Nicholas's house. Nicholas was a renter. 5 years after Sandy, the house where he lived was still unrepaired without electricity and weak plumbing. The roof leaked. There were mold and few furnishings. It was located on the same property as the homeowner. It's a bungalow. There's one in front, one in back. Nicholas was in his early 20s, unemployed, and struggled with mental health and addiction issues. In addition to stable, safe housing, Nicholas needed a long-term social worker to help him through his health challenges and find employment. While the owner of Nicholas's house had chosen to have his property bought out, Nicholas had not. As a renter, Nicholas didn't have a say. If the homeowner participated in the program, Nicholas had to move. My agency, HPD, was able to provide Nicholas with a housing choice voucher, also called Section 8, as well as moving expenses. Housing choice vouchers help make housing affordable for low-income individuals. Vouchers can pay 30% of their income towards rent and utilities, while the government pays the remainder. Nicholas struggled to find a landlord who was willing to accept his voucher as payment. Although it's illegal in New York City, source of income discrimination, it is still common. The demand for the type of housing and services that Nicholas needs exceeds supply. When the wait lists for affordable housing and supportive housing are thousands of people long, the fact that Nicholas happens to be a climate refugee does not seem reason for priority treatment. When I last heard from Nicholas, he had moved in with a friend and was still looking for a landlord to accept his voucher. In my 6 years working on the city's hurricane recovery team, I participated in hundreds of conversations with city planning staff regarding storm damaged neighborhoods and areas that face severe future flood risk. In discussions of policy tools and solutions, the major constituent was consistently framed as a homeowner living oblivious to or in defiance of physical risk. Rental tenants don't fit easily into this narrative. The well-being and stability of rental tenants has little to do with access to information. Instead, is historic patterns of inequity and the weakness of the American safety net that create choice-limiting constraints. Buyout programs may be logical and fiscally responsible in changing landscapes. However, without significant investment in the development of comparably priced housing in communities without risk, reducing the available housing inventory displaces the problem and does not reduce overall vulnerability. We have to treat housing as a basic infrastructure, similar to sewers, transit, and roads. We cannot consider other infrastructural changes without significant investment in affordable housing first. Thank you. And I will unshare my screen.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I guess we'll move right along just to keep on time to Jen.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is been a slow internet day. Well, it was a real treat to hear from Dan and Kelly and Deborah, who are, it's like meeting my footnotes. I used your research and your information so much, so it's just very informative. I would like to share this with you, but I'm sorry. Okay, maybe this is coming now. No, this doesn't look right. I'm very sorry.
Jen, if you want to drop a link in the chat, I can try screen sharing for you.
Okay, let me just try that. Oh, wait, here it comes. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to risk doing the, I'm going to just keep it in this mode so it's not full presentation. I don't want to, it's feeling very fussy. Okay. All right, so let me get on with this. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. It's such a great group and a great discussion and such important topics. I am with the University of Miami's Office of Civic and Community Engagement. Our office was created to enhance university and community collaborations, to engage the university's academic resources in the larger community. Part of that work was, in addition to the programs that we offer, we also kind of developed a research background and acumen in affordable housing. And so the idea had been, maybe we'll take on an issue that's important in Miami, changing every couple of years. Affordable housing has remained our focus because it's just that critical. Miami is one of the least affordable cities in the world. We have, according to the most recent report from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, we have the largest share of severely rent-burdened households, owing to a combination of low-paying service sector jobs and incredibly high housing costs. On top of the housing issues, we also obviously are at the forefront of climate change. So we have this poor octopus on the left who found his way into a parking garage during a high tide event. And this graph from the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative just shows that Miami and our neighbor Hialeah are the lowest on the readiness scale. So we have some work to do. In addition, this is from our friends at Climate Central, the most vulnerable cities to coastal flooding, 21 of the 25 cities in their assessment are in South Florida. So it's just an everyday reality that just is getting more pressing. The number of affordable housing properties we looked at by that would be impacted by sea level rise. We looked at this by county commission, and you can see, kind of going up to 2090, it just sort of jumps. But this is the kind of information that, we think is important for communities to understand. I should back up and say that the kind of the goal of our office is creating affordable housing tools and advocacy, reports and research that can support, planners, municipal leaders, community organizations, nonprofits who are involved in affordable housing and community development discussions. So this kind of data that's kind of straightforward and easy to understand, this is really where we, it's kind of our bread and butter. On climate vulnerability, this is from Deborah from the Furman Center. And this just shows Miami is in red, and it was looking at the public housing units in the floodplain in other southeastern cities in the hurricane zone. So obviously Jacksonville, Tampa, and Houston are much smaller, but regardless, the percent of public housing that's in the floodplain is quite high. And in fact, our recent work showed that 41% of all public and assisted housing developments are in the 100-year floodplain. So to kind of shed some light on the data side of affordable housing, we developed the Housing Solutions Lab, which is a suite of tools that, like I said, are designed to be used by the general public with varying degrees of technical kind of proficiency. They're straightforward and meant to provide a really rich data resource. So this is our map tool. This has over 250 data filters. Traffic information. We also have municipal boundaries. Miami is very unique in that we have 34 distinct municipalities within Miami-Dade County. And by distinct, I mean they have different garbage pickup. The services are all very distinct. So it can be very confusing knowing whose jurisdiction is governing. So that these maps offer that kind of information. This map shows the pink dots show all of the public housing, and the purple are the assisted housing developments in Miami-Dade County. We collect this information through, we have a very close relationship with the county's public housing department. We also work with the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies at the University of Florida, which tracks this information. Map, I'm showing you two slivers of map. This is another, kind of way to look at this, which is the cost burden by census tract. So the red areas are showing, census tracts where over 75% of residents are cost burdened. So this can be a very informative tool for, we have a lot of red in parts of the county that are not served by public housing developments. So it's a helpful kind of advocacy tool for considering future development. Another tool that we developed is called Land Access for Neighborhood Development. And the intention for land was to map all of the vacant land that was owned by a government, one of our 34 governments, a kind of anchor institution like a university, and a faith-based organization, to show the potential for areas of aggregation to develop new affordable housing. Our initial research showed that, a lot of people say there's nowhere to put affordable housing. We can't, everything's taken. We found that through all of this work and looking at the vacancy data, we had over 500 million square feet of of vacant or underutilized parcels that could be redeveloped. This shows the county's SMART plan for proposed extensions to our public transit, which we do have. It's small, but this is most of it. It shows the half-mile station buffers so that users can zoom in and really kind of work on a transit-oriented development. And further kind of diving down, Land offers a calculator function. So in this example, these two parcels here, you can click on them to see if you were to aggregate these two parcels, what you find that you have a lot size of 63,000 square feet. If there were any encumbrances on the property, that would show up here. We have recently updated this tool to include city and county zoning districts so that people can take a closer look at what is permitted to be built. We have opportunity zones. So we're constantly, these tools are all very much in progress. We're always refining them. In response to sort of our community input. Another tool that we developed is the Housing Policy Timeline, which looks at the history of housing-related policies in South Florida over time. And we also have the Miami Housing Policy Toolkit that was a collection of different programs and policies that had been, best practices in other cities, and that we thought are things that are actually could be achievable in Miami to consider from a policy perspective. Our newest work is bringing the climate piece of this in line with our affordable housing background. So that I joined the office to help lead the work on our housing resiliency in a sustainable South Florida project. So we had the intention was to look specifically at affordable housing in light of the sea level rise implications, what those could look like for those properties. That kind of very specific nuanced data mapping had not really existed to our knowledge before this. So this was really an area that we saw was a gap, and that we heard from our community partners was something that they wanted to see also. We had a great stakeholder group we had the chief resiliency offices from the county, the city, and the beach. We had a number of nonprofit organizations, other professors from Florida International University, and other groups. And it was a very robust discussion group. One of the kind of products of this was to look at potential adaptation strategies that could be considered for buildings in Miami. So we did an assessment of all the different types of public and private affordable housing buildings, and sort of narrowed it down to these 4 main typologies that we saw most frequently, and then looked at risk adaptation based on these other criteria. So what kind of population are they serving? Who owns it? What are the various risks that are there, including, are they in a flood zone? Are they, is their subsidy, the tax credit that was used to build them, is that kind of coming up to expiration? And then the typology. And this helped to inform a cost benefit analysis that we undertook to look at the, kind of the 3 prime straightforward kind of adaptation strategies of wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing, and elevation. But as a way of really starting a conversation about what this looks like specifically for affordable housing buildings, this has really kind of expanded the city of Miami, and enterprise community partners are working on a building level program called Keep Safe Miami. That's really kind of looking at this at a real parcel level. But there's a lot more to go.
If you would be able to wrap up in the next minute or so we could.
Got it. I'm done. I'm almost done.
Thank you.
The kind of the big project that we worked on was the update to the Miami Affordability project that I showed you, which was layering on top of all of the affordable housing data, information about sea level rise. So we included flood zones, projected sea level rise, projected storm surge that we developed with our colleagues at the Rosenstiel School for Marine Science at and elevation data. And this is kind of a snapshot of the different layers that were included. And this really, it allowed us and users to better understand specifically which neighborhoods were at risk. We had a great launch event in December with the county mayor, Daniela Levine Cava, and the tools are all up on our website. And we recently got further grant funding to continue this work, which is really exciting. And we'll be looking at extreme heat and the impacts of extreme heat on affordable housing in vulnerable communities. So sorry for talking too much, but thank you very much.
No, it wasn't too much at all. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for giving such abbreviated presentations. I wish we could have more time with all of you. So Christian and I have some questions that we got from members. They emailed them in and just other questions just to kick off the discussion, and then we'll open it up for others to just pop in. I think one of the questions we want to start with, just like a softball, getting in the mood, is what you think, what your take is on the biggest gaps that are needed to address affordable housing as it comes to current and future flood risk. whoever wants to start.
I think since I presented more of an advocacy position, I'll take that. Which I think the biggest gap is that there really isn't a lot of energy and initiative for constructing affordable housing as it relates to the effect climate change has on diminishing both the quantity and the quality of existing supply. And as we saw from Dan and Kelly's presentation, like nationally, there's an affordable housing crisis. And so the only way to really deal with the vulnerabilities created both by climate and by that crisis in itself is by constructing significantly more housing.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in as well that our partners at the National Housing Trust, they've pointed out this systemic shortage in affordable housing, and that it's shrinking and disproportionately impacting people of color. They also point out that while not building affordable housing in floodplains is part of the way forward, there's just this need to rehabilitate the housing that already exists to be able to withstand climate impacts like coastal flooding.
I'll just say one thing. In Florida, I think we right now there's a debate going on about funding for affordable housing. It's called the Sadowski Trust Fund, and it's going through the State House now, and they're looking to. The proposal was to kind of take that funding for affordable housing and put it into 3 different buckets for water management, infrastructure, and then housing. I think there's it can't really be an either or. It really diminishes the capacity of the people who are impacted by all of these issues are the same people who are live in very substandard housing or are paying way too much. So I think the consideration of them in tandem is really important.
Thanks, guys, for those answers. Yeah, I'm going to jump to, I think, a question that came up in the chat that I don't think was answered yet from Osamu, who's asking Deborah if if the displaced renter get any compensation that's in line with the URA, the Uniform Relocation Act requirements.
So great question. So I manage the Uniform Relocation Act disbursement for permanently displaced tenants. So provision of a Section 8 voucher and moving expenses falls within the URA. I think what URA provides is wholly inadequate as a statutory benefit for what's needed to actually relocate low-income tenants. And I think it's really a very important time to look at congressional modifications to the act to deal with the extent of the challenge facing potentially displaced persons by climate risk.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think I saw. I think HUD's put out some trainings about the URA that are coming up. I saw something about that, but I'm not sure.
It doesn't change that it doesn't do enough.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Deborah. Another question from the chat. This was for Dan and Kelly from DeCarlo. I don't think this was answered in the chat, but DeCarlo's asking, how did you all deal with the earnings gap, the federal cap at 75K of median earnings when dealing with the affordability calculations? Places in MSI, areas around HCOL, homeowner corporation owner loans areas, knowing that cheaper housing in some areas brings down those numbers. So Dan or Kelly?
Yeah, actually, I think we don't, just checking here, we don't directly deal with earnings gaps, but we do count homes below local market rates as affordable. So that was my response to him in the chat window.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that.
No problem.
Okay, I think this was a question that came in from one of our members from before the webinar. This is for Deborah too. This is the Furman Center estimates 300,000 LMI older high flood risk pre-flood map housing units in flood zones These are housing that always get flooded. How do we work together to adapt the buildings now so they don't flood, and then work at relocation of housing back from coastal areas? Why are nonprofit housing advocacy groups so against getting LMI housing safe from flooding?
Ooh, that's a complicated question. So, New York's building stock is very varied. So what it means to elevate or retrofit a house for flood risk is very, very different based on the type of building. And, with 1 to 4 family homes, the options really are you just either eliminate the livable space or you physically elevate the building if it's a kind of structure that can physically elevate, which we have a significant amount of masonry structures, which are pretty hard to deal with, as well as attached structures, which I could spend semi-attached and fully attached structures, which are really complicated because you need all the owners to agree. But when you start getting into the multifamily building stock, like it's a really complicated game of Tetris on what you can do to retrofit the building. So the first question is, does it have basement and ground floor units? Because then you're eliminating those units, which regardless of whether it's just a privately managed building or an affordable housing building, that changes the finances of how the building operates. And if it's public housing, then in many cases, depending on the source of income, source of what's funding the retrofit, the tenant would be deserving of relocation benefit, which in public housing is extremely difficult since there aren't any vacant units. So then the last thing is, if you're not displacing units, but you're just displacing equipment, like the building's mechanicals, you have to put them somewhere. And if you're putting them in other space within the building, you're probably displacing something, or you're moving the system to the top of the building or to some other space on the property. And that gets into like very, very complicated work, because you might be totally changing over the mechanical systems of the building to allow relocation of the equipment. And suddenly you're hitting other building code requirements. And so it becomes very complicated with the age of the building stock. So we have a significant amount of housing, both regulated in some way or unregulated, where it would get pretty close to substantial improvement, if not over it. And then suddenly, if you have a 6-story walk-up that has 12 units, and you have to now, that's a walk-up, and you now have to install an elevator, then you're losing half the units. So it's not a simple nut to crack. That doesn't mean it's not critical that we find ways. But I think one of the reasons there is resistance to some of the improvements to the building go back to this challenge of what's lost when you make the physical improvement to resist, to withstand one kind of physical risk, you might be creating another problem. And some buildings are just not in great shape to begin with. So this is my personal opinion, which is just that we just need a lot more new buildings.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks, Deborah. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, but I see in the chat 2 folks had wanted the question about, are any of these programs including the added risk from rainfall and or riverine flooding? Maybe Dan and Kelly, you guys could start with that one.
Sure. So our analysis is coastal, so we do not incorporate rainfall. There may be a bit of riverine in our data set, but it's focused on the coastal states.
Gotcha. And Deborah or Jen, do you guys want to add anything to that?
Our data is based on the projections from the a consortium of South Florida researchers called the South Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And every 5 years they come up with new projections. Christian, I don't know if you know, I don't think that includes, I think that is just coastal flooding. I don't think that includes rivers or rainfall rather.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I guess it's partly captured if you're showing like FEMA flood zones. But I think we all know that, doesn't account for future rainfall or extreme events. So, okay, great. The last question is sort of a bigger one, but I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to it a little bit. Can any of you talk more about the climate gentrification phenomena and the justice implications? How strong that connection seems like it is, obviously kind of varies by place. And then what communities need to consider when designing interventions to address that? Maybe that came up in some conversations or work you guys have been involved in.
I can just start talking about that. This has been I talked with Christian about this last week. This has been a very big topic of conversation in Miami. We still in our office are kind of grappling with exactly what the term means. How do you measure that? How do we, how can we know if it's climate gentrification versus the fact that, there's less expensive housing in a centrally located location. I think from our perspective, the issue is there is something happening. There are, pressures, and what can we do about them? I think, in Miami, on the coast, people are still building. We still have high-rise developments going up. And I think as long as those are, I think eventually this becomes a policy decision and discussion about, I think, how do we kind of think about that kind of development going forward? The other thing I would say is that in Miami, we have, I think the poster child for this issue has been a neighborhood called Little Haiti that has been, the focus of a lot of speculation, in part because it is at a higher elevation than much of the county. I should note that in, our when we did the analysis of affordable housing buildings in Miami, half of them are located below 7 feet of elevation. So we are incredibly low. I mean, that's a very real pressure. I think, some of the thinking on that from learning from what happened in Little Haiti with this very large scale development is, in Miami, we don't have a lot of community benefits agreements. And that is something I think in a lot of other municipalities, I saw somebody asked about inclusionary zoning. We're preempted from inclusionary zoning. So there are some areas that we really have our hands tied. And I think that is going to take some very creative policy solutions.
Any of the other speakers wanna give comments on climate gentrification or any of the implications of relocation as it relates to affordable housing? Speak now, or we might have to end the meeting very soon.
I mean, I think it's just a really important issue when you look, like New York's housing market is kind of an anomaly in that it had a significant storm event and real estate prices went up in coastal areas rather than down. So the question is, when you're looking at like risky areas versus extraordinarily high risk areas, when you're making investments in other kinds of infrastructure, whether they're flood risk mitigation infrastructure or, roads, water systems, water purification, sewage, making sure that you're maintaining equitable access to housing in tandem with those investments.
Thanks so much. And I'm sorry, our